Module 8, and we are going to start the Roaring Twenties with 8.3. So let's start by looking at a major theme of the 1920s, which was a growing conflict between traditional and modern values. Rural America, or also known as the countryside, was seen as representing the more traditional spirit of the nation. People living in small towns and farming communities often prided themselves on being hardworking, self-reliant, religious, and independent. These values had shaped American identity for generations. But after World War I, cities started to grow rapidly, and they came to represent something very different. Urban areas were fast-paced, diverse, and full of new ideas, lifestyles, and opportunities. Many people in the cities embraced modern technology, changing gender roles, and a more relaxed way of life. To many Americans in rural areas, these changes felt like a threat, like the country was turning its back on the values it was built on. This tension between the rural traditions and urban changes shaped much of the culture and conflict in this decade. Let's dig a little deeper into this divide between the urban and the rural Americans in 1920s. For the first time in U.S. history, more than half of Americans, about 51%, were living in towns and cities with populations of 2,500 people or more. Cities were becoming the face of modern America. Urban areas were seen as the symbol of progress. They were centers for science, technology, new ideas, and culture. People living in cities often had more relaxed attitudes towards things like drinking, gambling, and dating. Cities were also very diverse, filled with immigrants, African Americans from the Great Migration, and people of different religions and cultures. In contrast, rural America still held tightly to conservative moral values. Life in small towns was slower and centered around close-knit relationships, church, and tradition. Many rural Americans viewed the city lifestyle as shocking, immoral, or even dangerous. They felt like it was too fast-paced, too impersonal, and too focused on money and pleasure. This tension between the urban and rural viewpoints would show up in many of the big issues of the 1920s, from prohibition to immigration laws to debates about science and religion. One major example of the changing values in the 1920s was prohibition, the nationwide ban on the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages. Reformers, especially those from rural and religious communities, had pushed for this ban for years. They believed that alcohol was the root of many social problems. They blamed it for crime, domestic abuse, poverty, and general moral decay. They argued that getting rid of alcohol would strengthen families and improve society. In 1919, the 18th Amendment was passed, making prohibition the law of the land. The idea was that by eliminating alcohol, society would become safer and more virtuous. But enforcing prohibition turned out to be a huge challenge. There was simply not enough money or manpower to police the entire country. Many Americans, especially in the cities, did not support the ban and found ways around it. This led to a rise in illegal alcohol production and organized crime, which we'll talk about more in upcoming slides. As prohibition took effect, many Americans didn't stop drinking, they just went underground. The people who smuggled, sold, or made illegal alcohol were called bootleggers. Some bootleggers smuggled alcohol from Canada, the Caribbean, or even Europe. Others made their own, known as moonshine, often hidden in stills outside in the country. It was dangerous and sometimes deadly. Poorly made alcohol could cause serious health problems or even death. All of this illegal activity helped build powerful criminal empires. One of the most infamous gangsters of the 1920s was Al Capone in Chicago. He controlled the city's illegal alcohol trade and became incredibly wealthy, making around $60 million a year. He didn't hesitate to use violence to protect his empire, and he had many of his rivals killed off. Many people wanted to drink, so secret bars called speakeasies popped up all over the country. These hidden nightclubs were often in basements or back rooms, and you needed a password to get in. Inside, people drank, danced, and listened to jazz, all while breaking the law. As cities modernized and American culture shifted during the 1920s, many people began to feel uneasy about the fast changes. In response, some Americans turned back to religion, specifically a belief system called fundamentalism. Fundamentalism is the belief in a literal interpretation of the Bible, meaning everything that was written in it has been taken as exact truth. Fundamentalists believe that society's problems like alcohol, abuse, urban crime, child neglect were the result of people turning away from their religious values. One major area of conflict was over education. In many rural areas, teaching evolution, or the idea that humans developed over time from an earlier species, was banned in public schools. Instead, schools often taught religious-based lessons that focused on creation as told in the Bible. This tension between the science and religion became a national debate, and it would eventually lead to a famous court case we'll look at known as the Scopes Trial. One of the most famous events of the 1920s that symbolized the clash between modern science and traditional religious values was the Scopes Trial. In 1925, a young science teacher named John Scopes was arrested in Dayton, Tennessee for teaching evolution in his biology class. At the time, Tennessee had laws banning the teaching of any theory that denied the biblical story of creation. The trial turned into a national spectacle. Clarence Darrow, a famous defense lawyer, represented Scopes. On the other side was William Jennings Bryan, a well-known political and religious leader who led the prosecution. This wasn't just a trial. It became a symbolic battle between two worldviews, science and progress versus religion and tradition. Reporters from all over the country came to cover it, and it felt more like a circus than a courtroom at times. In the end, John Scopes was found guilty and fined $150, but the case was later overturned on a technicality. Even though Scopes lost, the trial raised awareness and sparked debate about education, religion, and freedom of thought in modern America. During the 1920s, it seemed like American economy was booming. People were calling it the Roaring Twenties for a reason. But a lot of that success was superficial, meaning it looked great on the surface, but underneath there were serious weaknesses. Mass production, especially in industries like automobiles and appliances, made it possible to produce 50% more goods than before. With all the new products, stores began popping up everywhere, and mail order catalogs made it easy to shop from home, even in rural areas. But how did people afford all these new things? Many used credit. They bought now and paid later. This became common with installment payments, where people made small monthly payments on big purchases like cars, radios, or furniture. At the same time, people started speculating on the stock market. That means they were buying stocks not because the company was doing well, but because they hoped that the price would go up and they could sell it fast for a profit. The problem with this? Well, if the price dropped, they could lose everything. This kind of economic behavior created an illusion of wealth, but it wasn't stable. The cracks in the system would become very real by the end of the decade.